David, muchas gracias por compartir este espacio con nosotros. Ante todo quiero felicitarte en nombre de la comunidad afectada por la ELA en Argentina por el flamante Premio Humanitario 2021 de la Alianza Internacional de Asociaciones de ELA. Sabemos de tu voluntad y de tu trabajo internacional, de haber conformado el Consejo Científico Asesor de la Alianza, así que bueno, un placer contar con vos, y además porque sos una persona muy prestigiosa en cuanto a lo que tiene que ver con la investigación mundial de la ELA, siendo el vicepresidente de investigación de la Asociación ELA de Canadá. Así que bueno, un placer volver a contar con vos. Creemos que es importante conversar con vos para poder aclarar a la comunidad afectada por la ELA y a la comunidad en general en relación a qué significa participar de un ensayo clínico, cuáles son las características, los criterios, el proceso de reclutamiento, cómo se llega a obtener un centro multinacional o internacional para poder aplicar a los ensayos clínicos, considerando nosotros que la ELA, tenemos muchas esperanzas en la cura de la ELA, y que habiendo muchísima investigación hoy en el mundo, todavía estamos esperanzados en los nuevos ensayos clínicos que hay. Así que un poco se trata de esto, que nos puedas ilustrar un poco en relación a este proceso para participar en ensayos clínicos, y cómo está hoy la investigación mundial de la ELA y la participación de los pacientes en los ensayos clínicos.
But I think one of the key pieces is that the alliance in particular, I have a big drive on this. I don't know that I have the time to put into it as I would like, and I think a resource would be good for this. And I know there are clinicians who are big on this as well, which is, you know, we're going to get to a point eventually where we have more clinical trials than the capacity of the sites to hold them, because we're going to have more there are more companies that are interested in working on ALS than ever before. And if they bring those to clinical trial, we're going to need to expand global sites to be able to run those clinical trials. And I mean, South America, it would be a prime site to start having more expanded clinical trials from industry to be able to go, and Eastern Europe, South America seem like good spots to be able to start to expand clinical trial sites. What would be needed, I think, is obviously training, the infrastructure of having a physician or a neurologist who, you know, wants to do that. That's a key piece, is you need to have someone who wants to add research to the care piece that they do, and then need the funding for at least enough staff, probably 1 to 2 people minimum, who coordinate that research. So they are a person who is, because the neurologist will not have time to do all of the heavy lifting, all the work that needs to be done to make sure that the trial is done properly, effectively, has the right documents. And so an individual who is specifically what we typically call a clinical research coordinator, or it could be a clinic nurse that could do it, or someone who is able to support the clinician in making the operations of the trial happen. If you have those things in place, the right training, the physician who wants to do it, and a staff member who can manage those, it can happen. And we've seen it happen in Canada in sites where we had no clinical trials before, in rural populations, where you have a champion neurologist, a person who can run the trials with them as a personnel, and then the right support. And so I think that there's huge value to the world to bring places like Argentina and Colombia and Brazil and Eastern European countries into the realm of starting to help build what's needed to bring more clinical trials there. Additionally, I would say what's valuable, very valuable, in my opinion, about running trials in South America or in Eastern Europe or in more trials in Asia is we're going to get a different, right now what we have is a very North American, Northern Europe, like European centric idea of how treatments work. because almost everybody who is in a clinical trial is of European descent. And that's not great either. That's not diversity. That's not, when we go to extrapolate a clinical, a therapy, first of all, if it fails, we don't know if it would have failed in all populations. And if it works, we don't know if it's going to work in all populations. So the more we do globally, the better it's going to be for the world in terms of ALS. And so I think there are some people who want to see this happen, and I think it just needs champions. But that's not to say it's not happening outside of the country and it can't come in and help and start to build within.
David, pero ¿cómo se inicia un proceso de estas características en un país?
So I would ask multiple people their opinion on how to do that. My thought process would be, first step is make sure you have a neurologist or a physiatrist who wants to do this. Now, first thing, without that, if you don't have somebody who is going to say, look, I have all these people I care for, and I work hard medically to take care of them. If I don't have the time in my schedule to also build in research, or I don't want to do the research, you'll go nowhere. So first thing, you need a champion, a clinical champion. The second piece would be, is there any funding to support a person, or do they have somebody that they can find at their hospital or whomever who can be the person to run the clinical trials with them? So sometimes a good practice can be, maybe you've got a clinical trial happening in the same place on cancer or muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis or something. And sometimes you can share, if they have a person who's running trials with them in the same institute, sometimes you can share that person if they're not working full time. So there are ways that this can be done. And this is where someone like Dr. Genge or, John Glass or any one of the prominent European clinicians would be able to provide advice on how that might be able to help train somebody on ways they can look for that. Then I would say you go to, first of all, I would say go to those champions as well to ask for advice, but you can simply reach out to a company like Cytokinetics is a great company to reach out to and say, look, we would love to see this in the future. We would love to see industry trials come to Argentina. For you to ever want to come here and run a trial that's got a site here in Buenos Aires, what do you need? And they would probably tell you, and they would probably help you to understand, because that's a great company that has really tried to champion new sites and get them built up. And they've done this in Canada. And I'm sure they would be happy to talk about it in other places in the world. So that to me is the place you start, is get the champion, and then speak to companies and to prominent clinicians about asking what are the next steps you need to get there.
¿Qué opinión te merece hacer un llamamiento o un llamado general a un registro de personas con ELA para participar en ensayos clínicos?
I think there's always value in any kind of gathering of information, if you're able to do it in a good and effective way, gathering information around your population of people who are affected by the disease. And the more information you can gather, the stronger it is for you and for the rest of the world to be able to get that information for whatever reason. In terms of for trials, so currently, if it's for trials outside of Argentina, I would say the best thing for anyone to do is really to go online, find where there's a trial, if they're willing to travel, and if the site is willing to take them, because for the most part, they would be concerned that they won't come back for future visits. If they're willing to go to a site, and then that would probably be the best way to do that. If it's for future trials that would come to Argentina, I would say probably one of the best ways is to get the clinic to really know their patients very well and be able to proactively go to the people that fit the criteria of the trial and say, look, this is an opportunity for you. This is an option. In terms of collecting as your organization for a registry, I think you have to know really what it is you want to collect them for. And if it's for trials, you need to have somebody who's really going through that data and helping to match people for the trials. So you would almost need somebody who is qualified enough to be able to go through and contact people and say, look, I think you might be eligible for this particular trial, and know how to help them get on into the study. So I think there's value for sure in registries all the time, but I would suggest at this point, the best thing to do would be to look at who has strong registries and talk to them about how to make sure you would develop it in the most effective way. So Ireland with Orla Hardeman has a long time registry, good one. We have one in Canada called the CNDR, the Canadian Neuromuscular Disease Registry. That's valuable to learn about the demographics of the country and a little bit about real world evidence after something's approved.
We always been in touch with Paul Mehta from the CDC.
Okay, so you have the CDC
Atlanta
one, right?
He gave us a video conference last year, and he was even he came to visit us in Argentina. He and Kevin Horton,
right.
They both came here to Argentina in 2015. And so yeah, and they explain us very well how a registry works, and it is clear that it's not an easy task to undertake.
Yeah, it really needs to know exactly what it is you're trying to get out of it. It needs to be designed to make sure that you can get that out of it. And then it needs somebody who's an active person working on it at all times. Like that's their job, is to manage the registry. So with regard to trials, I think the first best step would be, if you do get trials to Argentina, more trials, whoever is the person that is running the trials for the physician, whatever the clinical coordinator person, make sure they're very keenly aware of the patients that come through that clinic, so that they can provide them ample opportunities. Like if a trial comes and it has specific criteria, they'll go to everybody who fits that criteria and say, would you like this opportunity? I would like you to know that this opportunity is out there. You can choose to be in it or not. And that's how you can really recruit people well, is because nobody really seems to know. No one's going to know the patients at a clinic better than the clinic itself, because they're going to see them come through and see what state they're in and who might be amenable to research and who's struggling and maybe doesn't want to be involved in research. And that's how someone like Dr. Gensch has been very successful, is she hires personnel that are very proactive, but know the patients that come through the clinic and are able to reach out to them to provide them opportunities.
Acá en Argentina intentamos hacer un registro nacional de ELA basado en el modelo de Estados Unidos. El intento sería tener una ley de registro de ELA, pero básicamente intentábamos buscar epidemiología, incidencia, prevalencia, mortalidad, información demográfica, examinar factores de riesgo, la etiología y las causas de la ELA. Y bueno, en Argentina no es notificable la ELA, con lo cual es muy difícil poder implementarlo. Eso fue un problemita que tuvimos, y necesitábamos más actores que funcionen colaborativamente para poder hacer una inferencia que realmente sea estadística para armar un estudio epidemiológico. Es muy distinto a lo que ahora se está proponiendo, y nosotros consideramos que un registro de ELA va en función de eso y de informar sobre ensayos clínicos disponibles para que uno pueda seleccionar en función de todos estos datos los criterios de accesibilidad a los ensayos clínicos.
Yeah, and it's outdated quickly. That's the problem with trials, is that if you take information from somebody today and then a trial's available in a year, they won't be eligible anymore. So I think for trial's sake, it's hard to do it via a registry as opposed to some more active person-to-person support or at least an active person on the registry that knows who is recently fitting the clinical trial criteria. But I think I think collecting data to better understand Argentinians with ALS in general, better understanding the stakeholders in the population and the demographics that you have there are critical. And I think that that's a really great first step. And I think epidemiology is underrated in its value in terms of better understanding our population that we're trying to treat. So I applaud you for starting even down that path, because I think that that's very important. And I don't know whether you have a publicly funded healthcare system like Canada or the UK, or whether it's privately funded like the US. But if it's publicly funded, then I would suspect that most people well, maybe not most, because I shouldn't say that, but a large chunk of people would funnel through certain neurologists in the country. And if you could get them to report, or them to be the point of access for a registry, that could collect a lot more people, because inevitably they're going to see those people at some point. But I guess it depends how many different neurologists across the country are treating people with ALS and how hard that would be.
Our system is mixed. Most of it is publicly funded. Some of it is privately held.
Okay.
So yes.
David, ¿vos considerás que la ELA tiene cura y que solamente hace falta investigarla?
One person's belief is that one thing we're going to have to do is find ways to get to people earlier, diagnose earlier at a time point where treatments are beginning at an earlier time point than they are now. I think that's going to be critical. I do think that as we understand the disease better, we're going to get treatments that will have a stronger effect. They will be better than we have now. Most of what's in trial, and I'm fine to say this anywhere, most of what's in clinical trial right now would be considered somewhat generic, meaning these are things that so a good equivalent would be, we know that there is inflammation and an abnormal immune response in ALS. We don't know exactly every key factor that is important in ALS for that. And a lot of therapies that are on clinical trial are just repurposed anti-inflammatory, anti-immune products that are trying to see if they have an effect, but they're not based on true ALS research. This is what's happening in ALS. So we still need to understand, I think, what are the key pieces, key targets, and how do we understand why one person might be different from another, and how different medications may actually work for one person with ALS versus another. And I would point to, as an example, cystic fibrosis is a disease where for many years we gave very generic therapies, and it had a little bit of an effect. It did do some things. It helped people live longer. Once we understood what was going on in the actual disease, we now have extended the lifespan of people from, 15 years old to now 50, 60 years old that people can live. And I think we can do the same thing with ALS. So I think the answer I would say is we can stop ALS, we can treat ALS effectively, but we still have a lot of science to understand to do it well. But there are things that could probably have a small effect that are closer.
Bueno, no sé si él querrá contarnos un poco cómo son los pasos para iniciar una investigación científica o un ensayo clínico con los pacientes.
That could be a longer question. So if I'm a person living with ALS and I want to get involved in a clinical trial, contacting the site, if they're if they believe that I fit the right criteria for that, then you go visit and they do what's called a screening visit. So they basically go through all of the criteria with you to determine if you fit those criteria. And if you do, and everything works out, they would enroll you in that clinical trial. And then you would basically be visiting the clinic the same number of times as the trial outlines in their protocol. And you would be going through the measurements that they have aligned for that particular study. So it's a scientific study, and you're showing up for visits to be basically measured or to report on how you're doing. And in some cases, if it's an oral therapy or it's something that can be taken at home, you may be taking doses while you're at home. And in some cases, it could be an injected type therapy where you go into the clinic, they do the injection, and you'd also get followed up on with all the information. And you basically go through the process, and then at the end, you know, it's either done, or if they have what's called an open label extension, the company sometimes provides the drug for free for a while for the individuals. And the only other thing would be in that the best trials, the ones that are further along to try to prove if they work, would be placebo controlled. So in the end, you may get randomly assigned to be given the placebo, and you would not know if you're on drug or placebo, and the physician who's measuring you also doesn't know. And the point is to avoid any of the bias that could prevent you from for the results being some skewed based on you know, believing that you're on something that may be working for you without knowing whether you're on it. But there are many different ways you could answer that question, because it could also be, how do you get to a trial if you're in Argentina and you want to go to Boston for a trial? Well, contact them and then find out online if you might even be worth going there to get screened, for example. And but I'm not sure if that even answered the question. So it depends on the way that the question was meant to be asked. Yeah.
David, is there anything else you want to add or show to us?
For now, I think I would leave it at that. But I would just say, in response to, you know, the question about what's happening, there are a lot of people working every day on this around the world. They are speaking to each other. They are collaborating. We are getting more collaborative every day. And I have no doubt that people living with this disease feel alone, abandoned, like there's nothing for them. But there are a lot of people who care a lot around the world who are working very hard to try to make this happen. And unfortunately, it's very complex and doesn't have the funding levels that cancer or HIV or other things that have better treatment options have right now. And so it's going to take a little bit more time because it's very difficult, but we will get there. And there are trials out there right now, and any one of them could become a potential therapy for ALS that could work. So just a reassurance to people that there are a lot of good people working very hard around the clock on trying to fix this, and that it's just very difficult. That's what I would say to try. And it's hard for that message for people, I'm sure, to accept, but it's the truth. And I wish we had better.
A very short and a very short question for a very short answer. What is the approximate number of ALS clinical trials happening right now around the world?
It varies from time to time, probably around 70 or 80 that are happening, and probably 5 to 10 that are in a stage of really trying to understand if they're going to be a therapy, really at that kind of important stage, and a lot of early investigatory ones that we hope will become more prominent in the days ahead. But the other hope piece I would add to that is there are at least 150 or more companies that are interested in the ALS space that want to do development of drugs. And that is really exciting, because 10 years ago when I started this role, it was probably between 15 and 20 companies. And now we're talking 150 plus.
David, ¿hay alguna idea estimativa de cuánto es el costo de un ensayo clínico, de generar un centro de ensayo clínico en un país como el nuestro?
It would be the cost of the individual who would be running the trial with the physician. So a cost of salary for somebody to do the work. And the rest of the money should be paid by the company. So the company will pay for everything it takes to do their trial, except for personnel at the trial site to run it for them. Because what the trial site is doing is providing a service to the company, to the pharmaceutical company, to run their trial in an unbiased way. So really the number one piece of cost is the personnel support to run it. And then you just need to attract someone who is willing to take a chance on that site to be to run the trial for them, and they will pay what what happens is, so if you just one quick minute, one very quick, sorry, I have another meeting at 2, so I was just going to let them know I'll be a minute late, but just very quickly, like, Dr. Genge's clinic in Montreal is a great example of one that, as you run more trials, and you do a good job at this, more companies will want to come to your site if you're recruiting, and they're willing to help pay for more infrastructure to do the trials better. And over time, you can build up a bigger and stronger clinic, because the companies ultimately, you negotiate a budget for what you are needing to do the trial for them. And so you can start to put in costs for personnel and stuff into these things. But at first, you really need someone to help support the personnel to do the trial, to get someone to take a chance on you. And that's how it builds. And that's how a trial site builds.
David, again, thank you so very much.
No problem.
You are so kind, and we knew you were the right person for this. I don't know, it's just the way you explain things. You are so educational, as I told you, and thank you very much.
No problem.
This
Anytime.
is greatly appreciated.
Anytime
Okay.
I can help, let me know.
Okay, adiós, amigo.
Adiós.
Muchísimas
Nice
gracias.
to see you, Sebastian.
Thank you so
Dario, un
much.
fuerte abrazo.
Pablo.
Gracias y un fuerte
Thank you
abrazo
so
a todos
much.
los amigos de Canadá.
Thank you.
Gracias.